Extinction Rebellion are a new movement causing disruption all over the world. In this episode, we examine their claims. Well, they have certainly caused disruption, claiming that the world will end as we know it now in just 10 or 12 years unless we take immediate, massive actions. But just how true are their claims? Well, let's start by taking a look at one of their spokesmen responding to Andrew Neil on BBC.
She's a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Welcome. I've seen some of your activists claim on TV that billions of people are going to die in quite short order. One of your founders, Roger Hallam, said in April, our children are going to die in the next 10 to 20 years. What's the scientific basis for these claims?
So these claims have been disputed, admittedly. There are some scientists who are agreeing and there are some who are saying that they're simply not true. But, the overall issue is that these deaths are going to happen. We don't know exact numbers, and actually it's a little bit, concerning to focus on just how many deaths. There will be deaths and mass suffering, and that, any amount is enough as far as we're concerned.
But most scientists don't agree with this. Climate change scientists, those who know there is a problem and it has to be tackled and things have to be done, more has to be done that's being done. I've looked through the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the latest AR5, and the October of last year special report. I see no reference to billions of people going to die or children going to die in under 20 years.
Well, I don't think he was claiming that that was from that report.
No, I know that, but what I'm saying is I don't know where the scientific validity comes for that. I mean,
so there's a lot. How
would they die?
Mass migration around the world already taking place due to prolonged drought in countries, particularly in South Asia. There are wildfires in Indonesia, the Amazon rainforest, also Siberia, the Arctic.
What Andrew Neil is exposing here is that there is simply no scientific consensus, no scientific basis for the rebellion extinction claims. So let's just take some of the examples she's given about claimed weather events causing all these problems today. They are simply not true. First of all, let's take forest fires. As you can see from the graph here, the forest fire acreage lost back in the 1920s and 30s was many times today's values. And that is not just down to firefighting skills, because those big peaks back then coincided with much higher levels of temperature than we have today and much longer periods of drought. In fact, it was the long-term periods of drought that not just drove the farmers from the Midwest away from it in the Dust Bowl year, but also caused mass migration throughout the world, because the droughts that they were experiencing in the middle of the United States then were worldwide and occurred in nearly all the continents of the world. Turning to the Arctic that you mentioned, here this graph is showing the ice extent in the Arctic and Antarctic over a long period of time, and these are just natural cycles. We will be dedicating individual climate awareness videos to these different subjects. But at this point, it is worth pointing out a few facts about CO2. CO2 is essential plant food, and it has been absorbed by shells and animals and buried in the world in the form of fossil fuels. That has subtracted the CO2 from the atmosphere, and it actually had reached dangerous levels. Life ceases to exist on Earth at 150 parts per million. But prior to the Industrial Revolution, it had reached 280 parts per million, and that seems to be the figure which, by just coincidence, everybody is seeking to get back to. No one has actually decided what the right level of CO2 is. But what we do know is this: if you put CO2 into greenhouses, which is common practice, the trees grow much, much faster. Just adding CO2 to the ambient CO2, look at the effect here. And of course the man-made CO2 that's been going into our atmosphere has added greatly to the vegetation on Earth. In fact, vegetation on Earth over the last few decades has increased by some 14%, and that is equivalent to the entire USA landmass being vegetated. This is an enormous benefit of CO2, and it has led to record harvests in Africa and even a record harvest in France this last year. Plants are growing much faster, so starvation is the exact opposite of what we're going to get with increased CO2. But that is the subject of another climate awareness video. And of course, despite what she says, just throwing out words like Arctic and Amazon, there aren't any migration deaths or deaths coming from those events now. In fact, the Amazon was just a routine burning by the farmers of their crops. We'll now let Andrew Neil point out some further inconsistencies in the spokesperson's points.
These are all really important problems, and they can cause fatalities, but they don't cause billions of deaths. They don't mean that our young people will all be dead in 20 years.
No, perhaps not in 20 years, but I can't speak to what Roger was,
He's one of your founders.
With that. He's one of the members of Extinction Rebellion.
Roger Hallam is the joint co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and here's what he has to say.
The fact of the matter is, we're facing mass starvation in the next 10 years, social collapse, and the possible extinction of the human race. It couldn't be worse.
And now his views on capitalism.
You want to bring down the capitalist system as we know it. Is that
The capitalist system is going to be brought down by itself. The capitalist system is eating itself.
Well, no, but the point about your movement is that...
No, let me make this point clear, right? The capitalist system, the global system that we're in, is in the process of destroying itself, and it will destroy itself in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
The reason for that is because it's destroying the climate. The climate is what's necessary to grow food. If you can't grow food, there'll be starvation and social collapse.
That is so absurd. The extra CO2 in the atmosphere is extra plant food. That's what CO2 is. And the extra CO2 is causing huge increases in the crops of the world. So let's return to Andrew Neil and his questions on weather-related disasters.
I mean, you talk weather-related disasters. There seem to be a lot of them around at the moment, and people die from them. But on the latest figures I've seen, 100 years ago, weather-related disasters killed 500,000 people a year. Today, it's 20,000 a year. Still 20,000 too many, but it's a reduction of 95,000. It doesn't lead to the 95%. A reduction of 95%, it does not lead to a death of billions. I mean, aren't you scaring people with this rhetoric, aren't you?
And just to emphasise Andrew's point here, this graph shows the fluctuations, the cycles, in tropical cyclones, and they are absolutely natural.
I think there's a danger of scaring people simply because we're not taking it seriously enough, and people are feeling really, desperate that we're heard on this. And unfortunately, alarmist language works, which is why we're discussing it right now.
But does it work? It could. I mean, I've seen young girls on television, part of your demonstration, particularly the school ones when they take the day off to demonstrate, crying because they think they're going to die in 5 or 6 years' time.
No, it's not necessarily.
Crying because they don't think they'll ever see adulthood. And yet there is no scientific basis for the claims that your organisation is making.
And Andrew, of course, here is right. There is no scientific basis for totally scary claims, and they seem to justify them by saying they'll get attention by making them. Whether they're true or not is irrelevant. Let us scare everybody. That seems to be the argument, because that way we get attention.
The young people that I've spoken to aren't crying because they think they're going to die in a few years. It's because they don't see their children as having a future. They don't want to have children, and they're worrying about, coastal regions going underwater, other countries and island nations going underwater, the Maldives going underwater, the mass displacement that's happening, the weather extremes, which may be on a downward trajectory.
Well, that's just nonsense. She admits these weather events may be on a downward trajectory, which they actually are. But don't worry, they're going to turn up again. But that's despite the huge increases we've had in CO2. So we're getting less extreme weather, and we are, and the history shows that. But we've got more CO2. But it doesn't matter, we're going to plough on no matter what. But
climate scientists are telling us that they will be on the increase.
Well, take rising sea levels, because the sea levels are rising. There's no, the UN IPCC makes that quite clear. But even the UN IPCC says that its median projection for sea rising is 0.5 metre by 2100, by 2100, at the end of this century. Now that will create problems from places from Miami to Bangladesh, but 0.5 metre will not result in billions of people dying. If we do the right thing, it could be managed.
If we do the right thing, but we're not doing much at all at the moment, so this is one of the problems.
So now let's take a look at the history of rising sea levels, because they certainly have been rising since the end of the last ice age, when you had huge amounts of ice all over Europe. And of course, when that ice melted, it raised the sea levels, as we know. But since the massive slowdown in sea levels that you can see on the graph, the man-made element is tiny, and it's around about 7 inches to maybe 10 inches every century. So slight is this that the professor in charge of the UN Committee on Sea Level Rises resigned, because he claimed there's no point in it, because they aren't rising any differently. You must also consider that every single prediction from the IPCC mathematical models to date have been proven wrong, and not just slightly wrong, but hugely wrong. According to the predictions, the Maldives should be underwater now. Manhattan should be underwater now.
But you accept that 0.5 metre would not, if the UN median projection is right, would not result in the sort of apocalyptic predictions the your organisation makes.
They're very conservative numbers, that's what we'd say. And actually, a lot of the data in the IPCC report, not criticising scientists because they did an incredible job, they're using pre-industrial levels of data. They're looking at, carbon emissions. They're not factoring feedback loops, things like this.
The ignorance here is just amazing. All the climate models model feedback loops. In fact, there's a huge argument about the nature of those feedback loops.
There are climate scientists saying now that we think it's a lot worse. James Hansen, ex-NASA scientist, is saying we're in a planetary emergency. So we're using that language. We're not trying to use alarmist language. We're listening to what scientists are saying and using language that we feel is appropriate to the situation.
You are losing alarmist language. One of your other founders said that she thought everybody could be dead within several decades. 97% was the figure she put on it. But you want, at the moment, the IPCC policy, the agreed policy is to try and cut carbon emissions in half by 2030 and go to zero net emissions by 2050. But you want 2025 for zero emissions, only 6 years away. What would that require?
I mean, I'm not here to give you solutions and to tell you what we should be doing. That's not.
I know you're gumming up the whole of Westminster.
Well, what we're saying is listen to the experts. We're saying listen to the experts. Let's listen to what their ideas are, what they're saying. And at the moment, we're not putting those plans in place. We're not creating policies that reflect what those scientists are saying. This is why we're protesting.
But the experts have a consensus around getting net zero by 2050. You're saying 2025. You're not listening to the experts.
Well, there's some research into the IPCC report that was more recent by Professor Michael Mann, who looked at where they came up with the 2050 figure. And actually, they're relying on a carbon capture, biogas energy storage, BECCS, and there's a problem with that it's an untested technology. And by relying on that, there's a 50-50 chance that we will fail with the 2050 year in place.
You can always pick one piece of research. The fact is the IPCC report has 6,000 scientific references, 91 authors, and is a global consensus with review editors from 40 countries. But let's come back to the 2025 target. One critic has said it would mean the confiscation of petrol cars, state rationing of meat, and limiting families to one flight every 5 years. And that was actually on a 2030 target. Do you agree with that?
I agree that we need to do whatever it takes to bring emissions down, to allow young people to have a future, be able to have some hope for the future. And I'm not saying that because we're alarming children. I'm listening to what they're saying. They're learning about the consequences of climate change at school, and they're worrying about.
Of course, I'm not arguing about the consequences of climate change at all. But you would have to stop to reach your target. You'd have to stop all flying. Aviation would come to an end.
Possibly. I mean,
by 2025.
Again, this is something that we need to look at. We need to look at the aviation industry. We need to do an analysis on what needs to happen, and then we need to take action.
Well, we know what would
happen. On all industries, agriculture, energy, everything.
We know what would happen if
to be an expert in these areas.
If we stopped all flying. it would reduce global temperatures using the mainstream climate models by 0.03 degrees. 0.03 degrees. And you would stop all flying for that.
But what you've just said with the IPCC report, we're both in agreement that we listen to that. That's 99% consensus of scientists. That's great.
Here you see the blind obsession saying 97% of scientists agree. That's what she's implying. That 97% of scientists, by the way, is a rogue figure in any event, but that's for another video. But it is absolutely meaningless, because in this case, the IPCC themselves do not agree.
We agree with that. So that report is saying if we don't bring emissions down, so to halt warming
I understand.
to 1.5 degrees, so aren't we in agreement that we
it's
have
the 2025 target, which is the keystone of your policy.
It's a precautionary principle that
just ask you this. Most homes in this country are heated by gas. Most people cook with gas. The fact is, all of that would have to go in 6 years for a 2025 target, wouldn't it?
And so there we have it. This is what Climate Extinction are campaigning for. It is totally impossible and impracticable, and would mean the total ruin of the entire economy of the world. There is one thing that we can agree with Extinction Rebellion on, and it is this, that man-made CO2 is increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Here is a curve that shows just that, and no matter what we do in the UK, it will make hardly any difference at all, and nor have any of the climate change conferences like Rio or Copenhagen or Paris made any difference at all. The simple reason is that the developing world are building coal power stations and fossil fuel stations as fast as they can. Our trees and many of our plants evolved in CO2 concentrations 2 or 3 times what we have now. But this is a subject of another video.